It's time for Pure Performance.
Get your stopwatches ready. It's time for Pure Performance with Andy Grabner and Brian Wilson. Hello, everybody, and we're back with part 2 of our conversation with Finn Lorbeer, which does not count as another episode for him to be in the three-timer club yet, but he's getting close. Andy, we wanted to continue our conversation on another topic. Why don't you introduce that topic and let's dive into it?
Yeah. So, Finn, in our previous talk, you talked about feature flags or feature toggles, and I know I hear this more and more, and we use it internally at Dynatrace as well. But I wanted to get your thoughts on how do you start with feature toggle, and is it possible on an existing code base and then start feature toggling, or do you think it is easier and better to think about feature toggles when you build something completely new? And the other questions, a couple of questions that I have. So kind of what are your thoughts on how to get started? And the other thing is, how do you manage feature toggles? Because I assume the longer you build and work on a project, the more feature toggles you will have. So eventually, how do you consolidate? Will feature toggles at some point go away because you don't need to toggle them anymore because they're just part of the default set? And how do you monitor features on versus feature off? So I know there's a lot of questions. But maybe let's get started with
you have to remember
how do you get
all
started
of them. You have to remember all of them, and if you don't, we're not going to have you back.
Exactly.
Maybe we get sidetracked along the way as well. So let's
yeah,
it
could be.
I think it's easier to start on an existing project. To be honest, if you start on a green field, if you really start fresh, you have no users in the first place anyway, and there's no need to toggle any features. You just want to get your very first version of the product out. So unless you have users, it's not worth it to work with feature toggles. And if you really build a small application where every story adds a huge part of functionality, I think it's also very, very difficult to toggle because any story will touch a really big part of the application. Then you have to then it's a really big task to just build in the feature toggle. If you have a big, legacy application that is 4 years old, thousands and thousands of lines of code, and you just know your little corner where you work on, and there inside this little corner you build a small additional functionality, then I think it's much easier to toggle just in the environment where you're in, if you want to just make sure that your change or whatever you write is dead code in production for now. That's the idea, right? And once you ship your feature, so the way we do it, or the way we always try to do it, while you develop it, the feature toggle is on your local machine, obviously, on some test environment, and it's switched off in production so that users don't see half-baked features where styling is missing or some elements in the front end is missing. Anything that looks weird, we don't want to show them yet. This is all we want to achieve here. So as soon as we're done with a story or with a couple of stories that are together a feature that we want to toggle on, we toggle it on, we observe it, and the day later, we should take the toggle out, usually, unless there is some reason to keep it in. So this is how we try to reduce the amount of toggles. A story is not really done, or the conglomerate of stories is not really done if the feature toggle is still in there.
Okay, and how do you... So technically, are you typically seeing that you write your own feature toggle frameworks, or do you use frameworks that are out there? And what frameworks can you recommend or have you worked with?
The one we work most with is the toggles with a Z in the end, TOGGLEZ, a library written in Java. We also embedded it into our Clojure application for now. It has a really nice front end, and there comes another beauty of feature toggles. You can go to your product owner in the end and say, the feature is finished. Do you want to deliver it to your users? Do you want to hit the button that releases? And they are super glad. It's like they have tears in their eyes for joy. And this is what this toggles framework gives you for free. We didn't manage to get this in Clojure, but it's a very nice start. I've also seen people building it on their own, or on the other hand, if you have a small project, if you just have one or two things that you want to toggle, don't start with a framework. Just a toggle is nothing but an if statement. If you want in the beginning. And you can also in the very beginning, what I always want to do is to decouple deployments from feature toggles. So I want to deploy at some point, and at some other random point, I want to flip a feature toggle. But in the beginning, when you have just one or two things that you may want to show or not, just make it an if statement, global variable that is on or off, and then you have a feature toggle already. You don't need anything fancy for it. It's more the concept and thinking of how you deliver your software using this toggle that is the challenging part. And only when you have 5 teams over 2 continents that work on the same product, then you need to find a way that the pieces of work that you identified and the areas or code bases or parts that the teams or pairs touch are decoupled enough so that the feature toggles don't influence each other. Because if they influence each other, testing becomes a nightmare because you can't test all permutations of all toggles that you have in your code base then.
Mm-hmm. So then that brings me to 2 more questions. The first thing is, how do you test for correct toggling? So that means if you say essentially a toggle is like an if statement around a code block, how can you make sure that the developers don't forget to put the if statement around the code block that is part of that feature, especially if a feature is distributed across different classes and throughout the code base? Is there any best practice? Anything?
Merci chocolate for once.
Yeah.
In fact, so what works really well, I've tried it 3 times in 3 different teams and it worked each time, is to give chocolate for well-implemented feature toggles at the end of the story. Just in the stand-up and just occasionally, right? If you're in the stand-up, you're talking and the story was done and you have a feature toggle and it worked well and everything was nice. You just say, I want a chocolate. And that worked really well and everybody else is looking. So it's really mean, but it works. So that's obviously one part.
It's such like such a kindergarten approach. It's amazing.
Yeah. But keep it simple, huh?
Yeah.
And the other thing is, for backend toggles, it's more difficult. I don't have the strategy yet. For front end, it's much easier because if you don't toggle your front end properly, you will have changes in your front end in any deploy. So what you can do is to make pixel comparison of your product before you ship it. What I always want to do and what we will implement here now that we just went live, that we just start with this proper feature toggling, the next step for us here as well will be to have visual regression testing, but automatically so that we don't need the tester to look. We take a snapshot of our product, of the website, let's say of the start page, immediately before we release, because we know there is no feature yet, there is no feature toggle yet. This is how the website should look like without anything changing. Then we deploy the first commit, which is feature toggled, hopefully. So afterwards, the website should still look the same. We take a snapshot afterwards and we compare the 2 of them. They should be the same. We trash them. There's no problem in archiving, no problem if Firefox versions upgrade. In the meantime, it's just take a snapshot, wait 5 minutes for the deploy or less, take another snapshot. If you have some things that sneak out, you will have front-end changes, and then you detect them. If everything moves down by 10 pixels, you will find it immediately, what a manual tester would never see.
Yeah,
that's the strategy
cool.
for the front end.
Yeah. And so then you said, once a feature is, you turn on the feature, you let it run, and then eventually what you said, feature toggles should be removed once we know this thing is stable. That means you just then do, as part of a deployment, you just remove the if statements around the toggle. That's basically it. It just becomes part of the next deployment, and then the if statement that returned true anyway because the toggle was on will just be removed and the code runs just as before.
Exactly. And in the snapshot comparison, it also looks the same because it's switched on before. It's still switched on afterwards, just with the code parts that are dead anyway by now removed. And this should also match, and this works then really well. If you start to confuse feature toggles for A/B testing frameworks, or if you start confusing feature toggles as self-healing systems, then you will end up with a mess of feature toggles. So you have to be a bit strict or disciplined about when you use what, and if you want to introduce a new framework to achieve something else but feature toggling for development.
Mm-hmm. And how do you monitor? What's the best way to any approaches to monitor? Or well, let me ask you this question first, because then monitoring becomes easier to answer. Do you normally turn on the feature for everyone or just for a portion where it then becomes more like A/B testing? Meaning, do you turn it on for every user or?
That's the canary release you're talking about, right? Just some users see how it behaves. Until now, I have to say we didn't need that yet. I haven't been on a project. I know that you can do it. I know the charm of it. We didn't need it yet because the features were stable enough that we shipped so far. We didn't have performance problems. Or if you have performance problems, you usually don't see them with the first 3 users. At the moment, we have 20, so we switch it on for them anyway. I didn't need it simply so far. It's a nice concept, but if you don't need it, you don't have to introduce it right away. For the monitoring part, if you flip a feature toggle, so every commit, every deployment is fully automated tested. Before you release a feature toggle, that's a totally new functionality, and you probably want to test this manually, exploratory, and very serious with the product owner and maybe some devs even. And me as a QA, then I'm super curious how the entire software behaves and how I can break it. That's still part of my job, just not my only job. And then the feature toggle or toggling a new feature on or a new functionality is not an everyday event, right? That's maybe every week if you're really fast or even less. So that's something special. And then you monitor manually. You look on your dashboards. You look on your database requests. You look on your response times. You look on your error rate and everything. And if you see this rising up, then you toggle it off again. And if you see everything is fine, you leave the toggle. If it's still fine the next day, it's probably good enough to be removed.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I mean, you're right. You probably want to look at especially user behavior, right? But if you expose real users to a feature that you have tested well enough and you think it's perfect, your real user may still think differently about it. So that's why watching these metrics makes a lot of sense. What we try to do now, and I know you said you're watching performance and failure rate and then toggle it back manually. That's obviously one thing you can do. What we try to do now is with our monitoring data to actually then automate the mitigation. So that means, let's assume this happens at 2 o'clock in the morning, that something went wrong. Then the auto mitigation could say, hey, we are automatically turning off that toggle because this page that is now slow was just toggled on with this new feature. So let's toggle it off at 2 o'clock in the morning, and let's not wake people up, but they can come in at 8 o'clock in the morning and then figure out why we had to toggle it off. So this is something we try to do now with the data we collect and how we integrate with frameworks that, for instance, turn on and off certain features.
I wanted to ask, and I think I know the answer, but I'm not quite sure, because I was thinking about this while you all are talking. And, if we look at the microservice model, which I know I'm going there first because we're talking about starting this in more of a monolithic approach, because that's typically where you have your legacy code, right? But if we were talking about a microservice topology where you have anybody with their own service might be using your service, right? One of the things you have to take care about is versioning and supporting backward compatibility, because if you make a change with your feature, let's say, you might break another service that's using you that's not expecting that change. And there's all different kind of best practices in order to handle that. But I don't know if that really applies. And I guess that's really the question is, does this apply when you're talking about feature toggles in something in more of a monolithic code base? I would assume maybe not, because in your monolithic code, you kind of know everyone and everything that's talking to your feature. So it's not like you can just have some people randomly spinning up a new service. It's very well known what's accessing it, and any changes you make, you would, I think, automatically know the impact and who your consumers are, the customers of your feature are, that it would be a lot less of a risk. Do you think that's the case, or?
I don't know if this was only true. If you start with 2 or 3 services and it's 2 or 3 teams sitting next to each other, it's easy to keep an eye on it. If I think back to the auto auto environment where it's more than 300 services of 14 teams, I wouldn't be sure that everybody really knows who's consuming what API at what point of time. So I also think that there may be unintended changes. However, yeah.
I was going to say, but in more of a monolithic kind of code like you're describing right here, does that come into play as much because you suddenly don't have a bunch of different services or unknown amounts of teams interfacing because it's all basically this monolithic code base? Or am I thinking about it completely wrong?
So when you have a monolithic application where everything cross talks with everything else, and you add a new feature somewhere. If you add a new functionality, it's always easy to toggle, right? Because you shouldn't influence too much what is going on. So the way we did it in those cases for bigger application was to refactor the parts where we want to work on before we would add new functionality so that they would be more suited for a feature toggle. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can also strip down an existing monolith into some more domain driven or in a domain design where you get to know more or less the peers you're talking to, and then you can add it as well. If refactoring doesn't necessarily need a feature toggle because a refactoring shouldn't change your functionality, you should just remove some of the spaghetti code and where you struggle to find the places where you communicate to other teams or other parts of the system. But I'm trying to remember if we had any major problems just exaggerately speaking, just throwing a feature toggle somewhere in the middle of the monolithic code base. Rarely has an introduction of a feature toggle caused massive problems for other teams that were relying on one shared code base.
Okay, and you also talk about the permeation of testing. So how do you handle, like, is it, or maybe the whole idea is to avoid it, but let's say you have 15 features that can be toggled on and off in a release or that are alive at the same time. Is that a situation where you try, because I can imagine the test permutations of testing with features 1 and 2 on, 1, 2, and 3, or 7, 1, and 2 become way too uncontrollable? Is it more of a situation where the rule is you can only have a certain amount of feature toggles in a code base at a time to be able to accommodate testing well?
I think it's a theoretical versus a very real-world pragmatic problem. We discuss it all the time. We discussed it here on our project just last week on Thursday. So don't get me wrong. If you have 15, let's say you have 15 feature toggles, half of them are already switched on and half of them are not because they're still in development. 2 of them are long forgotten and all kinds of combinations, right? But the next feature toggle that will be toggled on is the next feature we are building, this messaging system, I don't know what, that we want to toggle next week. And it's a standalone release of this messaging system, right? So it's not like feature toggles are toggled on and off all the time. So we know pretty well what is currently toggled on in production. And we have one test environment before we release that has the same toggle configuration as our production environment. So before we release the very last high level and functional and end-to-end test and integration test environment that has the same feature toggle configuration than our production environment. So as long as we don't flip feature toggles, we have just one configuration that we have to test. We don't have to test permutations. Mm-hmm. But now you may toggle on or off the one or the other features, but those rarely happen random. Mm-hmm. And if mostly by an error case where everything went wrong already, so how do you test for everything is going to hell at the moment? Then you need to react anyway. So you can do a little more harm, I would say, and it's really rare. And you test before you toggle. We also test manually, right? What I said on this environment. So we make sure that we only switch on the toggle on the last environment before live production, and then we manually test the same configuration. If we are a bit unsure, we can still run the same test suite again and make sure it runs. And then we have all the toggles in production, and just one is different to the other environment. And then we go and say, okay, the feature is fine. We toggle it on in production, and we have the same configuration again. So this is what I mean by, in theory, all toggles could be different, but in practice, a flip of a feature toggle is occasionally, and therefore you don't have to test all permutation at all points of times.
So you shouldn't have that business owner with tears in their eyes turning features on and off at will. It should be much more planned.
Yeah, right. Going home and the evening just saying, "Oh, this looks nice. I'll turn it on. I think it's ready enough." Yeah. No, that shouldn't work this way. A more disciplined and mature team, as I said in the other episode. Another way, if you're a bit unsure, what you can also do, what worked well on another project, was to toggle all features off and run the test, and toggle all features on and run the test. Because feature toggles are really new functionality, and they shouldn't, or they rarely change your core business or the core user flow or the core of your product. They are tiny bits and pieces that are added everywhere. So they will rarely break your big functional tests unless you have a massive test suite that tests everything. Then you're doomed in many other ways. But if you have a very thin layer of end-to-end tests that just test your core business process, it usually isn't affected by those feature toggles. So we toggle all off, let the test run, toggle all on, let the test run, it's green both times, and we deploy then. Sounds a bit funny, but we made really good experiences with that as well.
It sounds like the description of this sounds like it's a hack way to be able to deploy features in a microservice style onto monolithic code, because typically you think of a monolithic codes being large releases with a bunch of changes. There's not too often a case where there's like a small release. Like with microservices, you can make a small change to one service, deploy it. Monolithic, it's a lot more time consuming and a lot larger impacts, but by putting in these feature flags, you're effectively allowing for these little small changes to go in that microservice spirit without actually breaking your monolith down into microservices yet.
Yeah, you're decoupling bits and pieces of your application in order to release them independently in a way. But everything I said applies as much for feature toggles, for microservices, right? Even if you have microservices, you don't want to ship half-baked front-end features. Yeah.
But that's a given in microservices. There's always this idea in monolithic that it's monolithic and everything's got to be big. This is a way to make small changes in monolithic in the spirit of microservices without actually having broken your product into microservices yet. So it's pretty cool. It's a cool little hack around.
I think the bigger challenge for a monolith usually is to get the pipeline fast enough to make it worth the effort. Many monoliths need a lot of hand-holding while being released and a lot of care while being shipped. I think this is almost the bigger challenge than when you've done this to also add a few if statements or a toggles library, to be honest. So I think this is even the smaller, the easier part with these feature flags.
Cool. Hey, this was quite a nice excursion into feature flags and feature toggle, and thanks for the insights. Is there?
Did we answer all the questions from the beginning?
I think we did. Yeah, because we talked about. Yeah, we definitely. I think you earn a badge. So we come up with some badges that we use.
You can print it
besides
out.
the.
You can print it out and put it in your email signature.
Exactly.
Excellent.
No, I think. Yeah. I know you mentioned toggles as the framework. In any others, because it's great to name one, but maybe it's better to name multiple in case you have some other toggle frameworks that you've seen out there?
For the last 3 years, over 7 teams on different accounts. That was the one I've seen everywhere if there was a library. Otherwise, it was smaller, way smaller custom-built toggles because it was smaller services that didn't require big libraries. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's cool. No, perfect. If you use it that heavily, then I'm sure it's a great framework and people should look into that.
It's a big and old one. It's well supported. It's really doing the job. So yeah.
Perfect. The only thing that I wanted to add to the monitoring aspect, I know we have some listeners that are obviously using our products. We have a great feature that maybe not many people know. All people know about it, especially when you do front-end features. If you are turning on a toggle, and let's assume that toggle is obviously generating some new HTML to show that feature, Dynatrace with our real user monitoring feature, or UEM, can actually capture this as metadata. So we can actually say which users are actually exposed to which version or to which feature. And then we can put them into categories and say, hey, how many people have been exposed to the version with the feature toggle on versus feature toggle off, or this feature toggle and this feature toggle. And then you can specifically monitor user behavior. So folks that are interested in, we can capture metadata through UEM, through our JavaScript agent, and then we can analyze this. So just an FYI for people, for customers that are listening, check it out.
So that's very, very nice. I can add, that's very nice for prototyping, right? If you just throw out a quick click dummy as a prototype, you can just see if people react at all, and if it's worth spending 2 months to build the actual feature.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah, very nice. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the only other thing I would add to the monitoring there is to make sure you make an indicator that you've turned on a flag in your monitoring tool, that you've toggled on a feature, so that if other things do start going south, you you know, oh, we just turned on a feature as well, right?
Exactly. So we can use our REST API to tell Dynatrace about, we just made this configuration change or deployment, or in this case it would be a configuration change,
right? Which
it is, right? Yeah.
Yep.
And Finn, were you practicing clapping? I heard a couple of this going on. Were you testing out the?
Was I? No.
Oh,
I don't know. I just brought. I don't know if you remember a year ago when we did the first episode. We laughed hard that I was sitting with my last name with beer in Germany after 4, and I didn't have a beer.
Yes.
So this time I brought it. Maybe I put it down on the table a bit too loud. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I was just referencing back to the previous episode when we were talking about. So in order to have your beer make a sound, you have to have the table and the beer. They have to work together.
Exactly.
So
yes.
It's perfect.
So now I have the last question. What's the brand? What's the brewery?
Berliner Berg. It's a new one, and it's a little brewery that brews really nice beer, not the standard huge breweries, that all produce the same product that just slightly tastes different, but a beer with characters. And the only brand we had in the fridge here at work at the moment. So, okay. But it's nice.
Oh,
very
Prost.
Nice. Sorry?
I said Prost.
Prost. Yes, Prost. Cheers.
Cheers.
Nostrovia.
Yeah. All right. I would say, hey, Finn, thanks again for doing the second episode. I think it was very insightful. And I think there's many other of these techniques that we should actually cover in future episodes. Besides feature toggling, I think in the future we should talk about blue-green deployments or canary releases. There's all sorts of techniques that favor rapid deployments or dark deployments and whatever you want to call it. But I think this was
deployments even, maybe yes.
Yeah. So we should think about that. And now you said you want to come back anyway once your project kind of evolves a little bit, and then we can talk about this, and then we should also think about other techniques. Awesome. Other than that, I say to summarize, it seems feature flags. There's a lot of great advice that you gave on how to test. Obviously, if you have multiple feature flags, you want to make sure you always test with what is currently in production, and then turn the feature flag on that you want to turn on soon. So please coordinate with your business analysts or with your product owners. And I guess what I also learned is that feature flags don't stay around forever, but they eventually obviously become just the features that you toggle become part of your standard features. So you just basically remove the if statement, which it basically is in the next deployments. So that was interesting. And monitoring is important. Figure out the user behavior, how users react to the new features that they get exposed to. And and start experimenting. I think that's also a cool thing. Start experimenting with new features and use feature flags for that as well.
And all I've got to say is thank you. I always enjoy our talks. Always overwhelmed with new information that I get to think about and ponder upon. So it's always greatly appreciated. So thank you once again for joining us.
Yeah, it was a very cool episode, I think. That was a beautiful summary. If I could have said this in those nice 5 sentences, it would have been a 2-minute episode. Next time, maybe.
But then we wouldn't have had all the nuance that is where you get the learning from. Yeah. But Andy's got a special skill and one day we'll see him doing something
But
much grander with it.
At least I have one. Yeah, at least I have one special skill. That's
Well,
good
that
to
and
know.
your dancing. Your dancing is number 2, right?
Yeah, that's
So-
maybe. Yeah, that's true.
All right, yes.
All right. Well, thank you again. It's been a pleasure to have you. And we'll see
Thank you too.
We'll have to see who becomes a member of the Three Timers Club first. So, challenge is on, people. And
Challenge accepted.
all right. Thank you very much.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.